Oh, there it goes. All right. Streaming on YouTube. Okay. There we go. Whoa, la la. Sorry about being slightly late. The rep from Oxford accosted me outside my office as I was coming in here. And I actually needed to talk to him because Oxford's textbooks suck. And I needed some help with something. So I'm a couple minutes late. All right. So welcome to October. Dun dun dun. 1 month gone. So it's 2 months, really 2 months and like a week to go in the semester. Okay, so we're going to keep going talking about theories of religion today, right? So we're going to start with talking about Peter Berger, and we'll see how far we get in terms of the material. We're running a little bit shorter on time than I'd like before the midterm, but I promise, we should get through all of the theories and have a little bit of time for review for the midterm on Monday, where I'll sort of lay out what the midterm looks like. And the midterm is next Wednesday. All right, so a week from now. Okay, so Peter Berger. So Peter Berger comes along a little bit later than Talcott Parsons and Robert Bellah. Kind of in the 1960s, he begins a lot of his activity and inquiry into religion. And he ends up being one of the most influential sociologists of the 20th century. If you've sort of dealt with any social constructivism in sociology, you've basically been looking at the work that's influenced by Peter Berger. He's a longtime professor at Boston University. And his biggest contribution are things like sociology of knowledge and his work on the social construction of reality. We'll talk about religion in terms of that. And his most famous kind of work when it comes to source of religion is what's called the sacred canopy or sacred canopy theory. Okay, so fundamentally, what does Berger believe? So he believes that humans and their social world exist together in a kind of dialectical relationship. So, society is the product of human beings for Berger, right? We create societies, we create different societies based on our different needs, our different kind of circumstances, where we are, what we are doing, right? Like the environment, what kind of foods we have available, what kind of agriculture we can do, or whatever it happens to be. Our societies emerge from us, right? They're not sui generis, right? They don't emerge from the ethereal mists of time. Human beings create societies based on their particular needs. That said, human beings are also the product of their society, right? So the society that you're born into ultimately shapes who you are, right? So it goes in this back and forth relationship that we produce societies and we are produced by our societies as well. So it's both the product of human inventiveness and it shapes our experiences and our understandings. Yeah, please.
Would it be a kind of chicken and egg problem, or which came first, humans or society?
I think for Berger, it's humans came first. They created societies. Once they created societies, those societies shape them and on this kind of dialectical cycle, right? And as conditions change, they alter societies to meet those new needs and those new kind of functions. But yeah, essentially. Okay, so for Berger, from a social perspective anyway, we live in a world of our own making, right? We have made, bless you, these societies that we live in. We have sort of produced them through human action, right? And through creating social structures and institutions and all of these things. And for Berger, religion is included in this, right? Human beings create different kinds of religion. And this makes sense, right? Berger is trying to make sense, in some ways, of the great variety of different human religions. So, obviously, religions don't emerge out of nothing. They don't, they're not handed down, at least from a sociological perspective, by some sort of deity and told, like, this is the shape of your religion, right? We shape religion right? We shape religions that suit our cultural milieu, our cultural needs, and all of those things. But religion also helps us make sense of the world, right? While we created it, it also gives structure to things that are happening, helps us understand the world, helps us understand why things are the way they are, things like theodicies, why there's evil and suffering, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, much like Smith, Smith's much later, but you'll kind of recognize Smith said something similar, that generally people are focused on the here and now rather than, the religious or the existential. For most people, just getting by in life is hard enough, that they don't really think about religious questions that much. It's like, how am I going to feed myself? How am I going to clothe myself? House myself? Find a mate, and stay alive for as long as possible. That, for Berger, occupies most of people's time. However, and again, you'll see this is a kind of running theme that we've talked about before, occasionally your ordinary life is ruptured, right? Things happen. There are dreams and nightmares that are remembered and affect waking life, right? If you've ever had a dream that you just can't quite shake, right? And in lots of cultures, this is interpreted as sort of messages from the spiritual world. And I mean, certainly it has been in lots of cultures historically. Awe and wonder, which is, something like sitting in nature can provoke deep existential questions. It's this particular thing that the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates thought was the beginning of philosophy. But just, sitting there and seeing, a beautiful sunset or the majesty of nature can provoke questions like, why is there something rather than nothing? Could such a beautiful sunrise really be the result of random or natural processes? And these sorts of things. And then, of course, the ultimate question, the one that troubles most people to some extent, the undiscovered country, that bourne from whose shores no traveler returns. Throw a little Shakespeare in there. Death, right? Death of people the possibility of your own death, often puts questions of mortality and, what happens after we die, if anything. Death will often shatter these your sort of normal everyday routine, and put these questions of mortality, eternity, the existential into a clear focus for people as they have to wrestle with these sorts of questions. So, all of that stuff. Okay, so all right, we got a couple of hard concepts here. Symbolic universes and sacred canopies. So we'll do our best to explain these relatively quickly. Okay, so for Berger, one of the primary ways that life is made meaningful and integrated is through what he calls symbolic universes. And basically, I have it here, symbolic universe, the kind of grand totalizing worldview that integrates different parts of meaning and coherent into a coherent whole. But think of symbolic universes, right, as a set of symbols, a set of ideas, and a sort of guide within a society as to what ideas make sense and what ideas don't, right? So we all live in some kind of symbolic universe because we all have sort of, whether we're aware of it or not, a codex or a kind of typology of ideas that we know make sense and ideas that we know don't make sense, right? What is intelligible, right? So what your brain can understand and what is unintelligible, right? Or you would just kind of think of it as nonsense. This is what a symbolic universe is. It sort of splits knowledge up, or statements, ideas, into the intelligible. Oh, come on, you. I might be spelling that wrong. And the unintelligible. I'm just going to write unintel. Right? So basically your symbolic universe is going to tell you whether an idea is like makes sense, it's intelligible, or it's unintelligible, it doesn't make sense, and therefore you can discard it right away. So everybody has some kind of symbolic universe, right? Whether you are religious or not, right? If you're, an atheist, you're probably going to put religious claims into this one, into this category of the unintelligible. If you're religious, you're going to put them here, right? But everybody has a symbolic universe, a set of ideas that make sense of the world, that help them explain what's going on, and that split ideas into the understandable and the not understandable. Okay, does that kind of make sense? Yeah, please.
So it's kind of different with everyone?
Potentially, right? Now, it'll tend to be relatively similar within groups, right? So, you're Muslim, I presume. Muslims are going to broadly share a symbolic universe, right? You're going to have certain ideas that are seen as making sense and not making sense. Atheists are going to have different ones. Christians are going to have slightly different ideas. So they tend to be relatively consistent within particular groups. It's plausible that, given enough individualism, everybody could have their own sort of symbolic universe. For Berger, this would be a problem because then there would be no shared meaning in society, right? Like most people in the West, most Canadians are going to have a mostly shared symbolic universe with maybe some kind of quirks, right? But like most scientific statements would be seen as intelligible, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Other questions before I keep going? Okay, so yeah, Christianity, Marxism, nihilism, karma, luck, fates, all of these, help make sense of strands of life and can legitimate social order. Now, for Berger, in terms of symbolic universes, religion's unique. Why? Because it puts things in the transcendent, right? Things beyond the physical world, or in a kind of cosmic frame of reference. So your symbolic universe for religion is going to be at a sort of like cosmic level, right? And you know it because, the deity or the revealed text or the philosophy that comes from that religion is going to put it in that cosmic frame and kind of explain all of it. Okay, does that still good? Okay. All right. So I should have put this diagram on the other page, but I'll go back to it in a sec. So basically, what Peter Berger suggests is that in the past, right, when religion predominated, that kind of symbolic universe that religion brings with it, and in this case, say in the West, he's talking about Christianity, would have constructed what he calls a sacred canopy, right? And basically, the sacred canopy is a sort of intellectual structure that sits over a society, and basically, rather than, let me put it this way. Sacred canopy is a little bit hard to explain sometimes. Life is chaotic, right? Most human beings' lives are fairly chaotic. Things happen that we have very little control over. Natural disasters, Donald Trump. No, I'm kidding. Well, of course, we have very little control over Donald Trump, but that's neither here nor there. Natural disasters, political movements, social changes, life, death, famines, plagues, all of that stuff. So the world that we inhabit really is precarious and transitory, right? Things change, nothing stays the change forever, and things are in a kind of constant flux. But this is really hard, Berger thinks, for human beings to live in, right? He actually thinks that human beings, I don't know why that one light coming on and off is really bothering me. It's like in my peripheral vision, and I'm like, am I going crazy? Now I just have to look at you for a moment. Nope. Okay, it's crazy making. Most people can't really, like from a social level, it's really hard to sort of deal with this idea that everything is chaos, right? That basically there's constant change, that nothing is permanent, that there's no order or meaning to anything. So what Berger says is that religion sort of solves this in a particular way by constructing what he calls a sacred canopy, right, over a society. So let's say that a society is say, Christian. Christianity is going to anchor the everyday events, whether it's plagues, famines, floods, military triumphs, military defeats, the rise and fall of nations and civilizations within a sort of larger frame of meaning, right? So that everything within a society is given a sort of meaning within a bigger cosmic order, right? Which he calls the sacred canopy, right? So if I go back 2 slides here, right, and I erase all my doodles without changing pages, right? This is kind of, this a very rudimentary model of the sacred canopy. But you see, right, everything in a society, family, friends, roles, beliefs, everything kind of sits beneath. But you could have social order, government, everything would sit beneath the sacred canopy. And governments come and go, societies come and go, civilizations come and go, the sacred canopy is going to be like, yes, but it all has some kind of meaning within this bigger cosmic frame. Okay. Now, basically, this is the way religion sort of structured the world, right? It gave meaning to the social world by locating it in the sacred, right? So why is the world the way it is? Well, because God wants it that way. Why is this person in charge? Why is the social order structured the way it is? Well, it's all part of God's plan, right? Or whatever, right? It's all part of, the cycle of karma, the cycle of birth and suffering and rebirth. All of, everything would be kind of framed within that in a religious society. There's a meaning to everything, and everything is there essentially for some kind of reason. So basically, religion helps make reality intelligible, right? It helps give a kind of meaning to what is happening in the world, and say, there's some greater purpose to all of these things, which allows people to deal with sort of the existential dread that comes with the chaos that happens in society. So, and yeah, religion, obviously, a little bit different than what Smith says, but it's different from other reality systems in that it links humans to the sacred. Now, what do I have on the next slide? I do want to say something very quickly here. Sacred canopy ultimately is what you would call a secularization theory. Or at least a theory that includes secularization as a key component. So basically, what Berger says is that basically, so religion, social construct made by humans that affects human behavior. We know this, right? Religious people act in particular ways, and we've looked at that already in this course because of religion. They structure their societies in particular ways based on those religious beliefs. In India for a long time, right, the caste system was ultimately a function of the Brahmin system, right? And there's lots of interesting things that can be said about that, but I don't want to make it the point of this. But that religion structured people's, that society in a particular way. Okay. Now, Berger's always really careful, and he himself, I believe, is a Presbyterian. So he's a Christian. Was never wanting to say that, the object of religion, God or the gods or karma or, whatever, isn't real. He's sort of neutral on this. But what he says is, all of the ways that we construct it in our lives, right? The rituals, the organizations, the institutions, the theologies are all human ways of sort of, enacting the existence of God or the gods, right? Basically through social mechanisms, acting as though those things are real, whether they are or not. Bless you again. I freaked out somebody in the past because I said bless you and they sneezed at home. And they were like, how did you know? But that is neither here nor there. Okay, so, right, basically we enact certain rituals, certain ways of being in society according to Berger, and that sort of brings the gods, or at least their effects, into existence, whether God or the gods or whatever exist at all. Okay, Now, he's also got this dialectical mechanism in place, right, to explain social change, because we always need to explain how things can actually change in sociology, and any good sociological theory is going to have this kind of way of explaining, why we're not still in the, bless you, in the same society. It's a sneeze fest in here today. Why we're not still in the same society as we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 1,000 years ago, right? Social change has to be possible. And so basically, if religion changes, according to Berger, society will also change. But the reverse is true. If society changes, religion is going to have to change as well. So there's this kind of like dialectical process always going, change in social structures, change in religion, all of those things. Okay. Now, here is the kind of kicker for sacred canopy theory. What Berger says is that, societies generally had a sacred canopy. If you go back to the ancient Greeks, right, obviously they had ancient Greek religion, the gods Zeus and Hera and all Apollo and all that jazz. The Romans had their own system, but somewhere from around 325 CE, right, or AD, when Christianity became tolerated in the Roman Empire, and then a few decades later, when it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the sacred canopy of kind of the West became Christianity. Now, what Berger suggests is that society from about the 1960s onward, right, and from a long process through the scientific revolution, the democratic revolution, the Enlightenment, through all of those kinds of historical social processes, that by the 1960s, Christianity, whatever sacred canopy it used to provide, now that canopy had a bunch of holes in it, right? And had basically broken down so that by the 1960s, Western society no longer has a sacred canopy, right? There's no kind of overall meaning system shielding Western society from, the idea that everything is just kind of existentially chaos. Now, for Berger, this isn't necessarily a good thing, but he just thinks it's sort of inevitable because modernity, I don't know if it'll write on here, is toxic to religion. Right? So modernity is toxic to religion. So as we move into modernity, religion is going to recede, and that sacred canopy is going to end up full of holes, right? So there's no longer a whole meaning system for the whole society. Okay. So he's an advocate of secularization theory, and I think I quoted him loosely, not verbatim, a couple classes ago, suggesting that he thought that by the year 2000, the few religious believers that remained would be clustered together in isolated enclaves, resisting the onslaught of a global secular order. Yeah, please, sorry, it's your. Not verbatim, but that's the sort of idea, right? I'm simplifying it a little bit, but the idea is, as you get reason, science, reason, rationalization of society, so he's very much following Weber here, religion is going to recede, right? That basically, and then all those things you could, like urbanization, pluralism, and we'll talk about this when we talk about secularization theories, but all of these things are toxic to religion, right? And so as they become more the norm, religion has to recede because people don't need it anymore and it doesn't fit with society anymore. So Berger doesn't think so because it's not like, there isn't a unified system that sort of holds the whole society in the way that, say, Christianity did, right? Where, I mean, if you go back to 1940, something like 98% of people in Canada or the US would have said they were Christian, right? That broadly shared set of beliefs allows that sacred canopy to exist. Once, that starts to fall apart, then essentially you can't have a sacred canopy because there's no shared system of beliefs. Now, people like Bella, and I had him back a few slides, would suggest that, say, nationalism, Nazism, Marxism, like fascism, these kinds of movements kind of come in to form something akin to a sacred canopy. But Berger doesn't think so. Berger doesn't think any of these, because they're not anchored in the transcendent as much as they might try, right? As much as Nazism is going to take, some of the pagan German gods and try to sort of imply that they're related to the Aryan idea. They're fundamentally kind of secular movements, and so they can't anchor things in the sacred or the transcendent. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay, great question. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I don't sigh for anything you said, just because I realize I'm so far behind my own pace. And I want to make sure we get everything I need for the midterm. Okay. So, secularization for Berger has two elements: the objective. We'll talk about this again when we get to secularization theories after the midterm, which is the declining influence of religious institutions and symbols in many aspects of culture and society, right? So think of, if you go back, say, to the early part of the 20th century or to the 19th century, religious institutions were kind of central to society. They ran the churches, the schools, the social welfare system, the hospitals, and they were kind of the center of people's lives. Increasingly, as we move into modernity for Berger, and I think this is fairly indisputable generally, those institutions have differentiated away from religion, and we now have this objective sense that society is no longer dominated by religion in the same way. So that's the objective side, that's the side you can kind of see in society. But there is also the subjective, right? A secularization of consciousness, where, most people, or a lot of people, once you enter modernity, no longer kind of lead their lives through the lens of religion, right? They don't look for religion to structure their lives, right? When they're making decisions about, what to do with their life, who to marry, how to behave, what are the social rules, religion starts to play a smaller and smaller kind of role in that generally, right? And again, we'll deep dive into secularization a lot. Mark Chavez splits secularization into kind of three levels, and secularization of conscious would sit at the kind of personal or micro level for him. But yeah, there does seem to be this sense of there's less religion in people in terms of how they make decisions in a lot of cases, or at least this was Berger's theory. Whether that's true or not is another story. Okay, so why the breakdown of the sacred canopy and the growth of secularization? So it could be scientific rationalism, right? He thinks that's a strong possibility, again, following Weber. Urbanization, again, this is kind of following Durkheim in a sense. Okay, it has a demon. Okay, so this is kind of following, say, Weber. I would say this is kind of following Durkheim. Right, the move out of the medieval village. The move out of the medieval village and into anonymous communities ultimately leads to a breakdown of social bonds and the bonds that kept people within those religious communities. As those bonds weaken for Durkheim and for Berger as well, people move away from religion. They become more secularized because those social bonds that kept people religious are sort of falling apart. Okay, you're annoying. Stupid light. Okay, pluralism. Here, for Berger, and I think this is true of kind of everybody in this period, pluralism, as you have more competition for ideas, right? As there are more ideas out there, more competing explanations for why the world is the way it is, right? From science, from secular philosophies like Marxism, fascism, and these sorts of things, right? And as people move from a communal frame, which was the norm in the Middle Ages, to a kind of individualist frame, there's more ideas, and either religions have to compete a lot harder, to sell their beliefs, but there's just more ideas in general that people can adopt. And this makes religion in general a much harder concept to kind of propagate, right? As there are so many more ideas, and I mean, people who look at kind of contemporary society will very much take a similar take on this, saying like when you have, say at your public school, Jews, you have Hindus, you have Sikhs, you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have atheists, right? This is this great selection of ideas. That one set of ideas that used to predominate, say in Canada, Christianity, doesn't seem to be on as solid ground anymore. Sorry, that light is really bothering me. Why? I don't understand. The university. Okay. Simply because you're now aware that there's a whole bunch of different ways of understanding the world, right? A whole bunch of different religions, and so your religion doesn't seem to be as solid. A, because not everybody adheres to it, and B, because you're like, well, which of these ideas is right? They all seem to have at least as good a case as any other for them, right? Okay. Yeah. And so for Berger, in modernity, religion shifts to more of a private or individual concern, and it moves out of the public sphere in major ways. Okay, so plausibility structures. So what is plausible and what isn't, right? What ideas can you sort of accept? Which ideas can you not accept? So for Berger, plausibility structures are important because they are these sociocultural contexts for systems of meaning within which meanings, things make sense or are made plausible. Okay, so what does this kind of mean? Basically, right, religions and having a sacred canopy comes with ideas that make sense, right? And you're told, essentially, because everybody agrees within a society, this idea makes sense, right? So for instance, in a Christian society, right, the idea that Jesus died, was crucified, buried, and in 3 days rose from the dead, is made plausible by that shared belief, right? That becomes something that is checkmark intelligible, right? It's like, yes, that can happen. It could have happened in that case because these assumptions that we have, right, within kind of the Christian system. In a Mormon society, right, the idea would be that, it's entirely plausible that the ancient Hebrews sailed across the seas, colonized the Americas, became the indigenous people here, and after his crucifixion, Jesus got over to North and South America somehow, and someone wrote down the Book of Mormon on gold plates, which were then found in like 1828 by Joseph Smith in upstate New York. What's that? Sure, and blonde, it all works out. Although recently the Mormons are friendlier to white people or to black people, but that's a relatively recent innovation in Mormonism. Again, I'm not making fun of Mormons. If you want to be really reductive, you can make any religious ideas seem ridiculous. But within a Mormon society, right, all of that is made intelligible because everybody shares the belief that that could in fact be what happened. It could be intelligible. All of those things are plausible, right? It's plausible that within that kind of system of understanding that the angel Malachi, am I getting that right? I don't know, buried gold plates or led Joseph Smith to where the gold plates are buried. I can't exactly remember my Mormon. What's that? I think it's Malachi? I don't know. Anyway, let's not dwell on Mormonism too much. Some angel, I think it's Malachi, but Oh, yeah, see, it's been a while since I read the Book of Mormon. Anyway, this is unimportant. Or it's super important if you're Mormon. But for our purposes here, whichever angel buried or led Joseph Smith to the gold tablets, that makes sense, right? Now, for Berger, under the influence of modernity, right? And again, I just want to highlight that word because it's super important, and especially when we get later to theories of secularization, Modernity is the key concept that people are going to fight over. Oops, I did the wrong thing there. Plausibility of a lot of religious systems is, evolution, the theory of evolution. And it was seen, though my friend Dennis Lammer, who teaches a class on science and religion at St. Joe's College, thinks this is reductive, but it was seen broadly that evolution, by natural selection, undermined, the origin stories told by religions, right? People have made the same case for the Big Bang Theory, even though the Big Bang Theory was actually, what's that? Not that Big Bang Theory, guys. The Big Bang Theory, right, the scientific theory, was actually composed by a priest, Georges Lemaitre, who was, I think, a Jesuit priest, who didn't see the inherent contradiction. But this idea that the universe emerges by some kind of natural cause would undermine, say, the Genesis story or other religious narratives of how the world emerged, right? And so for Berger, right, when you get these scientific explanations for why things are the way they are, religious thought systems become less plausible because you don't need them as much, right? Basically, religion ends up occupying a smaller and smaller area simply because you don't need religious explanations for all sorts of natural phenomena. From the origin of the universe to why that star, does a sort of zigzag in the sky at certain times of, I can't remember what it's called in astronomy. It used to be thought it was angels moving the star around. Now it's just the atmosphere or something like that. But as, a lot of things that were explained through religion are explained through science, religion occupies less and less space in society. And so it's made less plausible, right? Its truth claims and its plausibility structure are undermined, leading, of course, to secularization for Berger. Okay. I'm just checking where. Oh, I guess look at my buddy Rodney. We're finally going to meet Rodney Stark on the next slide. I don't want to run out of time. Okay, so plausibility structures. So they answer this, why do certain things make sense? How do people come to accept ideas? Basically, what Berger will say, they're socially conditioned to accept certain things as possible, right? That basically certain things are possible based on religious claims. And sometimes, right, this goes down, why do I have the structure of the Catholic Church? Right, because the Catholic Church is a really hierarchical social structure that basically says, the people down here, you're going to be told by this guy, the guy with the biggest hat, and all of these guys, what the truth is, and you're going to accept it based on, their kind of divine authority, right? And that's why in Catholicism, ideas are plausible. A, because God set this structure in place, and B, because, the Pope is the representative of God on earth, the vicar of Christ, if you will, and that gives him a particular authority in teaching people things and telling you what the structure of reality is. Okay, how are we doing with that? Does that all make sense? Any questions before I jump on to Rodney Stark? Yeah, please.
So, is this like religions kind of affecting the public, the public lives, lesser, I would say? Things like the laws are literally coming out of religious beliefs in the past, cheating on your partner when you're getting a divorce might get you more money or less money or something like that, or murdering someone literally comes from religious beliefs.
Right.
So can't you say that it's just going into a different perspective rather than just kind of disappearing?
Well, I think it's not to say that all of those social structures are going to disappear. One of the things that's going to happen for Berger is those structures that remain are going to have to find a secular justification, right? So if you're going to, have laws against adultery, you need a secular justification for that, right? If you're going to have laws against murder, you end up needing a secular justification. So even if, maybe things were anchored in a religious context in the past, those things sort of erode over time as the truth claims of that religion get undermined, right? So then if those things are to remain, you ultimately need a secular justification for them, right? Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? Okay, perfect. All right, I have 7 minutes. All right. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit. So here, this is my patron saint of sociology of religion, if you will. His name is Rodney Stark. I love him, as you'll find out, as we're going to talk about him a lot. So Stark is the author of 2 different schools of thought, both of which have been really influential. Okay, do I have a little bit on Stark? No, okay, I jump right in, but I want to tell you a little bit about Rodney. So Rodney Stark is a really unusual figure. For one, he enters the dialogue in sociology of religion in about the 1960s while he's doing his graduate work. And his graduate work ends up, he publishes like 6 books before he finishes his PhD. It's something it's unheard of. And this sort of allows Stark to leapfrog, I think it would be the term, the normal structure of academia, right? The normal structure of academia is you start as an associate professor and you play the game, you publish some stuff, you jump to you start as an assistant, you jump to associate, and then you move to full professor. But Stark's contribution to social religion is so massive by the time he finishes his PhD that he comes out and he's immediately able to negotiate himself a position as a full professor at the University of Washington. And Stark will always say, like to the end of his life, he died a few years ago, that it was that leapfrogging that allowed him to be so heterodox in his sociology, because he's a very heterodox sociologist of religion. He goes against the kind of grain, hates Durkheim, Weber, Marx, gets into fights with Peter Berger and all of the luminaries of the time, and offers completely different explanations for a lot of religious phenomena. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Stark is probably the most influential sociologist of religion ever. And he completely upends the field, right? Creating entirely new revolutionary theories of how religion works. He's also not a secularization theorist, one of the very few who doesn't think secularization is happening, which we'll talk about later when we revisit his lovely piece, Secularization, RIP, where he basically gloats about the fact that everybody else was wrong and he was right. But more on that later. So, his earlier contributions, though, are to 2 kinds of theories. One that are called rational choice theories, and probably the more influential one, which is called market theories. Now, they are closely linked, but we will talk about them in turn here. Okay, so Stark, what does he say for rational choice theories? Okay, so one of the things that he suggests, and you'll kind of see it in the name rational choice theories, what Stark, the move that he's sort of making is against some of the dominant ideas in the field that argued essentially that religion was irrational, right? That compared to the rationalistic systems coming out of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, people who made choices to be religious were doing so for irrational reasons, terror management, right? They're worried about what happens after they die, and such. And Stark comes in and he writes a lot of this in probably the book where he expresses the most clearly is one that we'll look at called The Rise of Christianity. But what he suggests essentially is that people who are religious do so, choose to become religious or are religious, do so on a rational basis. And they do so basically by weighing 2 things, rewards and compensators. So what Stark says is, right, in life, there are these things we would call rewards, right? They are things that people want out of life. They want power. They want wealth. They want, food. They want, a sexual partner. They want all of these things. They want freedom, right? They want all of these things. But rewards are often scarce and unavailable. Think housing in Canada. I don't know. Scarce or too expensive, right? So religion offers what he calls compensators, right? So for things that aren't available to people, right? So a reward, he says, is scarce if its supply is sufficiently limited that not everyone can have as much as they desire. Now, if you think like the ancient world, this is pretty clear, right? People didn't have a lot of power, they didn't have a lot of freedom, they didn't have a lot of food, right? In a lot of cases, their life was limited in major ways. I got 1 minute. I'm going to try to do a few more. Okay. Now he suggests the scarcest rewards of all are things that people want, but are simply not available to anyone. And here you can think like eternal life, right? Or some sense of what happens after you die, right? Things that are really unavailable to anyone. Okay, so since the scarcest rewards are the most valued, right? Everybody wants some kind of existential security. Religion often offers alternative means for getting those things, but often in the future or in heaven or paradise or whatever it happens to be, right? So religion will say, okay, you can't have enough food today, but if you do all of these complicated steps that this religion says, you can have an everlasting feast in heaven. Okay, and I got to leave it there, but we'll continue on with rational choice theories and market theories on Wednesday. We made good progress today. Okay, that went so fast. Goodbye, flickering light. And we'll see you on Friday. I'm sorry? Rational choice theory? Oh, his like biography? No, I won't quiz you on who he was, just his ideas. Hi.
I'm sorry if you already explained this, but why wouldn't scientific rationalism be considered to be like a sacred category?
Because it's not anchored in like something transcendent, right? So because it doesn't have a spiritual, right? You have to first for it to be a sacred canopy, there has to be some sense of the sacred, right? Or the spiritual or transcendent or something like that. So yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's a good question. Hi.
This is about your other class.
Which other class?
CHRCC.
Oh, okay.
So our quizzes, is that a